Here we are once again in another episode of your favorite podcast about international relations and geopolitics. My name is Fabio Almada, talking to you once again from the capital of the EU, Brussels. Today is actually quite a beautiful day. We've had a horrible summer, we were saying, but today is really nice. And I'm here with Valeria de la Fuente and Aramis Zinke as well. How are you, Valeria? Long time no see.
Yes, it's been a while. I'm doing well. We've had horrible weather in DC, but because of the opposite, it was way too hot. And it seems like it's finally cooling down. What about you, Aramis? How are you doing?
Doing very well, thank you. And yes, today we will talk about climate change, slightly related to the crazy weather we've been experiencing in our parts of the world, respectively. And more specifically, we will address how climate change will lead to more armed conflict. And this is a fascinating discussion because it allows us to learn which regions of the world are vulnerable to conflicts in the future and where the signs of conflict are on the horizon already.
We were going to divide this episode in 3 sections. In section 1, we will analyze the relation between climate change and conflict. And in this case, we're going to use the example of the Arctic as a key region for geopolitical tension due to climate change. In block 2, we're going to talk about water-related conflicts, and we are going to use the example of Egypt and Ethiopia. And then finally, in our last block, we will analyze how climate change has been an important driver for armed conflict in Sudan.
And before we start the episode, I would briefly like to get us on the same page where things currently stand with climate change in general. So currently, our planet has warmed up by around 1.1 to 1.3 degrees compared to pre-industrial times. We are already seeing the repercussions. So we have increasingly deadly wildfires, we have floodings, we have extreme weather events. The thing is that it will only get worse from now on. That's what we are expecting. It seems likely that we will surpass the 1.5 degree threshold. And depending on our action, we will end up somewhere between 1.7 or even 2.7 degrees of increased temperature. And the consequences of this increase is that food production will become much more expensive because land will be less fertile. Economies will be less efficient because it has to operate under more challenging conditions. And we will have mass migration patterns that are increasingly hard to handle because our terrestrial landscape is changing. Places where you could do agriculture before, it's not possible anymore. And then maybe places where it wasn't possible, it will become possible again. So a lot of impacts on our economies, on our society. And we're feeling currently an economic recession, but the impacts that climate change will bring will be much more profound than what we are currently experiencing. And this is why it's so crucial to deal with this topic in detail. So let's get to section 1, where Fabio will introduce us to the example of the Arctic.
Well, just before I talk about the Arctic and how geopolitical competition in this region is crucial as we can understand this nexus between climate change and conflict, I think first we can go to the basics and talk about this overview of the theory, right, of the connection, this nexus between climate change and conflict. Because, of course, we do not expect climate change to be the only cause that will likely increase the possibility of conflict in the future. But we can already start thinking that there's so many regions across the world that are already quite unstable. So if those regions then are affected significantly by climate change, we might as well just expect that the current status quo that we see might be tipped off and conflict might be most likely to arise. For example, it comes to my mind, let's say, ethnic tensions within a country with rising sea levels. Maybe one ethnic group is forced migrating to the lands of the other. And well, this could lead to the groups failing to share resources and maybe violence or conflict arising, right? So I could think of a lot of examples, but I think that's like the main line of that nexus.
Do you have any concrete drivers in mind where climate change might tip this balance that you've just mentioned and then lead to war?
Well, Hermes, I think that we can go to something that's quite obvious, and we've talked about it since the introduction of the episode, right? Which is the changing of weather patterns. I think that's going to be one of those effects, those primary effects of climate change. And this can lead to droughts. It could lead to natural catastrophes around the world. So I think that a big consequence of this will be mass migration. And today we're already seeing how complicated politically and socially the effects of mass migration are. But imagine what would happen if economically impoverished countries are overwhelmed and their weaker government structures might just crumble down. This can also lead to regime changes and violence, right? There's also the example of the alteration of the terrestrial landscape itself, right? Like we said, rising sea levels can lead to migration, but also erosion, like maybe the loss of wildlife, of crops, that can have a huge effects on the resources and the food supply for a lot of populations, right? And that brings me to the next example, which is that limiting access of certain resources. We can talk about water, we can talk about food itself, but it's going to be one of those things that like population will have to fight for if there's not enough supply for everyone. So, like we'll see a lot of consequences, but for economies all over, and well, countries will have to deal with it. And honestly, like seeing how international cooperation is today, I do not see that in the coming years, in the coming decades, things will be better, right? Like if we already have geopolitical conflicts and confrontations, what will be the case if on top of that, there's also these huge climate consequences to have to deal with? We'll see. There might be a lot of changes throughout the geopolitical panorama as well. Maybe we'll see the rise of other powers. As we will maybe talk in a couple minutes, the melting of the ice in the Arctic might lead to other resources and countries can rise, can fall. So the panorama might change in the coming decades, but if one thing is for certain is that climate change will impact every single corner of the world.
And Fabio, you mentioned the example of rising sea levels, but the landscape is also changing a lot in the Arctic with the melting of ice. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening there?
Valeria, I mean, it's no mystery that the Arctic has been a focal geopolitical point of tension throughout the past years, and this will only increase in the coming decades with the acceleration of the melting of ice due to climate change. And actors like the Council Arctic members, which are the US, Canada, Russia, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland, and other non-Arctic states, just as China or other European countries, are already starting to draw their attention to the economic opportunities and strategic significance of the Arctic. And here we can talk about the unexplored natural resources such as oil, gas, minerals, and as well as the melting of ice creating access to new routes of commerce and new shipping routes like the Northern Sea route, because this presents economic opportunities that can reduce shipping times between Europe and Asia. So there's a lot of profit to be made of this region. Hence, we will see competition throughout countries who can get the most out of it. Of course, that this heightened interest in the region might lead to more competition over these resources, these territorial disputes, and we might see even the militarization of a region, right? So all of these things are just amplified by climate change. And the Arctic states are faced with this challenge of trying to balance economic development, but at the same time, environmental sustainability and geopolitical sustainability, right? So as I said before, the need of international corporations and governments is crucial. And I don't know about you too, but I just don't see that at the moment.
There's so much geopolitical opportunity from the Arctic, and there's many countries that will want to make the most out of it. It's quite interesting to see how the powers are already aligning there. And there's also an interesting conflict actually coming up between China and Russia, because China would rather prefer to use this as a region for economic development that everyone can use, like the shipping lanes, and Russia rather seeks to militarize this region. Of course, Russia has a huge part of territory right next to the Arctic, and it will be very significant for its military. So the geopolitical dynamics that will unfold here in the coming decades will definitely be very interesting to follow.
Yes, Aramis, that is actually very interesting. And I encourage our listeners to go back to the episode from January about the relationship between China and Russia and how it not may be what it seems. But yeah, I agree with you. Competition for resources is not new in geopolitics. There's competition for oil, gas, and minerals that has played a central role in geopolitics and in the way states interact for centuries. And I think now it will be a matter of seeing how and whether states manage to build a system that allows both for this kind of competition and cooperation at the same time.
Now we are seeing all over the world that water is becoming a more and more important resource, and climate change will further affect the scarcity of water. So can you introduce us to the broader dynamics we are experiencing here at the moment?
Yes, so water-related conflicts are already happening, and they are only going to get worse. In 6 years, water demand is likely to increase by at least 40%, which is a very significant number. Demand for water will and is in fact already causing some countries to compete for access to water. The challenge here when talking about water-related conflicts is that they often overlap with other conflict factors or with other threats that are happening in the ground, such as economic upheaval, unemployment, displacement, food insecurity, interstate rivalries. So it is sometimes hard to pinpoint to the role that water plays within these conflicts, but it definitely acts as a threat multiplier.
So Valeria, do you have an example for us where water was already an important driver for a conflict in the past?
Actually, the most recent example of a major conflict where water was central was the Syrian civil war, both before the war and during the war. And I know that we often talk about the Syrian civil war as a combination of other factors, such as regime change, unemployment, displacement. But water did actually amplify a lot of those existing factors, such as economic instability and social unrest before the war. Syria was suffering an extreme drought that started in 2006 and went all the way to 2011. And it had devastating effects on the country's agriculture. It led to food insecurity, population displacement. And then once the war erupted, there was both intentional and incidental targeting of water systems and infrastructures. And this is a very interesting element because it's another side of water-related conflict that oftentimes we don't think about. These conflicts are not only about competition for access and control over water, but they often include the targeting of water infrastructures and systems because at the end of the day, it's an existential resource and it has huge value in a conflict.
Yes, and last week we talked about how the economic decline in Europe recently, or the economic recession, caused many voters across the continent to challenge their respective government. And we all know that what has caused the Syrian civil war was that people went onto the streets to protest the Bashar al-Assad, the leader of the country, and then this all-out civil war erupted. So people are sometimes saying, oh yeah, it was the protest against Assad. But what we can highlight here is that water and the scarcity and related to that climate change played a role as well to drive the instability in the country. So Valeria, do you have any examples for potential future conflicts that will be related or caused by water?
Unfortunately, there are many examples. There are a lot of examples across some of the regions that suffer from water scarcity, for example, the Middle East and North Africa, South Asia. But in this blog, I would actually like to talk about a case that I have followed for a while now. And I think that it just has the tangible element of the role that water plays in it that sometimes we cannot see in other conflicts where interstate rivalries or other types of threats and drivers for conflict kind of hide the element that water may be playing in it. So the dispute between Egypt and Ethiopia started back in 2011 with the construction of the Grand Renaissance Ethiopian Dam, also known as GERD. It is the largest dam ever built in Africa. This dam was built to provide electricity to Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a country where 60% of the population don't have access to electricity. So it obviously was a major infrastructure opportunity for the Ethiopian population.
So what were the major problems related to the hydropower dam?
The problem is that the dam is filled with water from the Nile River. And this river also serves Egypt's and Sudan's water supply, but mostly Egypt. By filling this dam, Ethiopia would cut Egypt's water supply by 14 to 50%, depending on how long they take to fill the reservoir. Decrease in water supply would harm from 18 to 67% of Egypt's farmland. And obviously, 67% would be a tremendous detrimental effect on Egypt's food security. And it could, as I said earlier, it could act as a threat multiplier. Although Ethiopia claims that the dam will not have any significant consequences for Egypt, Egypt has threatened to resort to armed conflict on multiple occasions since 2013 if they don't manage to reach a binding agreement.
Yes, and I love to look at those population density maps, because when you look at the one for Egypt, then you really see how important water can be for a country. So Egypt is a huge country, vast territory, but most people are living on the strips of land surrounding the Nile River. So the Nile River is just basically deciding where all of the country is located, where all the people are living. And then to cut off this crucial water supply or to limit this water supply in the Nile River, this is, of course, something of prime concern for Egypt because it will have big effects on their agriculture, on their economy. So have they been able to reach some sort of agreement to sort this out?
Unfortunately, not yet. Negotiations at the African Union and the UN Security Council have failed on several occasions. They've been going on for years and they've been paused and then they have restarted. And to this point, there are no updates that they will be reaching any agreement anytime soon. And now Ethiopia started filling the dam about 2 years ago. And Egypt is already suffering severe water scarcity. Obviously, it is hard to tell exactly what the effect of the dam is having in that water scarcity and the droughts that Egypt is suffering. But the negotiations have become more important than ever. And they resumed about 8 months ago, but really no significant progress has been announced. And I think that here it's important to talk about the challenges that are taking place in those negotiations. Because for Ethiopia, this dam is a very important project. They have invested a lot of money, and the Ethiopian Prime Minister has made great promises about it and the effect that it will have in the Ethiopian population's lifestyle. China has also invested a significant amount of money, with 1.2 billion only in the construction of the dam. But in general, Ethiopia is central for China's Belt and Road Initiative. So it is very unlikely that Ethiopia will want to compromise on that. And it is also very unlikely that Egypt will accept anything that would affect the water access that they have over the Nile River. As you already said, Aramis, it's very important for their population. And farming is one of the main drivers of their economy.
And even though what you've said, Valeria, that maybe a war might not be as immediate, might not be as likely as we might think, right? Like I believe that even in the case if the dam is finished, it wouldn't require to Egypt to declare an open conflict on Ethiopia. They could just destroy the dam, which would also be a huge breach of international law. But that would be the objective of their operation, not to openly have a conflict with their neighbor, but for the dam not to exist, right? So in a hypothetical situation, I mean, I think that could be the case. I think it would not be the first case that a state destroys a dam. I mean, we can think back of Russia doing the same with this dam in Ukraine in order for that river, I think it was the Kherson River, not to be able to, for the Ukrainians not to be able to cross it. So I could totally see a similar hypothetical situation in the coming years if this ends up happening.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I don't think war is an immediate war is likely, but if a major drought occurs without any binding agreement, then it may be hard to avoid conflict.
Valeria, to conclude this section, can you give us a few more examples of regions in the world that we need to look out for where conflicts over water could arise?
Yes, unfortunately, there's a really long list of these, but experts have been talking about potential competition over fresh water between, for example, Pakistan and India over access to the Himalayan mountains, between China and India as well for the water in the same region. And I have to say, I did some reading about these cases. We were considering using them as the example, but it goes back to the same thing that we were talking about. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what role water will play in these conflicts because the reality is that water scarcity in India is very significant, and it's very unlikely that Himalayan mountains water will be a solution to it. So a lot of experts say, well, yes, it can be a multiplier of dynamics already going on and tensions going between India and China, but it is not exactly the driver that they want to put the blame on. That's one example. There's other example that also includes a dam project between China and Laos over access to the Mekong River. There's also between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. There could be conflicts over access to the Euphrates-Tigris River, and then between Afghanistan and Iran over access to the Helmand River. So there are lots of cases, and again, there are disagreements over what role water will actually play, if it's only exacerbating interstate rivalries, but the reality is that it will multiply and exacerbate some of the dynamics that we're already seeing.
So for the final block of this episode, we will look at another compelling example of climate change impact on conflicts. And this is the struggle over arable land. As Fabio mentioned in the introduction of the episode already, our terrestrial environment is changing due to climate change. And this means that the crop yield of lands is changing as well. So regions that used to be hubs for agricultural production could lose their worth. And this will cause a lot of competition over these scarce arable lands to feed countries. And in places where you already have an unstable situation, climate change could become another driver that causes competition, and in this case, competition over arable lands that may lead to all-out war. And what I've just outlined to you is not some theory about something that may happen in the future, but experts are pointing to a conflict in Sudan. They call it the first climate change war, and they are saying the fight over arable lands was one of the most important drivers for the war to break out in the first place. And I want to go into a bit more detail with this example in this section right here. But for now, let me introduce the most important aspects of the civil war in Sudan. So in the west of the country, you have a huge region which is called Darfur. It borders Chad, Libya, and the Central African Republic. And in 2003, a war broke out in Darfur when the Sudanese Liberation Movement, SLM, and the Justice and Equality Movement, GEM, rebel groups began fighting against the government of Sudan, which they accused of oppressing Darfur's non-Arab population. And in response, the Sudanese government armed and trained local inhabitants of the area to create violent, semi-professional militias who were instructed to carry out a series of attacks against the rebels. And in the following years, thousands of villages were destroyed and their inhabitants were raped, attacked, and murdered. And those that survived the initial attacks were displaced or fled across the border to Chad. Numbers vary, especially because the conflict never ended. But what can be said is that hundreds of thousands of people were killed and millions were displaced.
However, Armis, I think that in the case of Sudan, even today, we're still seeing civil conflict taking place over there. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more how this can relate to climate change itself? Because to me, this sounds more like these eternal tribal issues and tensions within the government in this country. But how can this be attributed directly to climate change?
Indeed. So this is the perfect example that we've mentioned before, where you have an existing situation, these tribal tensions, and then we had climate change on top of it. But let me explain it in detail. So Darfur's population is made up of a lot of ethnic groups. And a popular distinction to label these groups is either Arab or African. But there's an even more important distinction, especially in this conflict. And it's the contrast between the agriculturalists on one hand. So these are people that grow plants and that always remain in the same location, and the pastoralists. So these are people who have herding animals and they move from one location to another. And historically, these two groups in Sudan, they have functioned mostly symbiotically. But then you had many sources of tension arising in the late 20th century. There was low rainfall, multiple droughts, and related to this, you had a declining productivity of the agricultural land. And you also had growing desertification in the region and population growth as well. So you can imagine that there was this growing competition over the scarce lands that were left. And this necessitated the two groups, the pastoralists and the agriculturalists, to expand their land and to look for new avenues to exploit. And a lot of conflicts erupted between the two groups over the grazing and water rights in the region. And there was no government structure to resolve these issues. And this is what has led to these conflicts. So in conclusion, we had many climate-related events, and then we had increased pressure on local authorities. They were not able to solve this issue, and then we had a war erupting.
So in this case, is there something we can do against arable land loss? You obviously talked about poor governance and how that may exacerbate the problems because they don't provide any solutions to it. But is there anything that can be done in this case?
So there's a very interesting flagship initiative by the African Union, and it was initiated to stop the expansion of the Sahara Desert, and it's called the Great Green Wall. And the project was adopted in 2007, and initially the main idea was to build an 8,000-kilometer wall of trees across the African continent to stop desertification. Now, they have learned that this is not really a feasible option. Just planting trees in general will not stop the desert. But they have developed a different approach where they are focusing on restoring land and making it arable. And the ultimate goal of the initiative now is to restore 100 million hectares of degraded land and turn it back into arable land, among other things, by planting trees. And with that initiative, they could capture 250 million tons of carbon dioxide and create 10 million sustainable jobs by 2030. And it could be a major achievement for fighting climate change and for improving food security.
I think I heard about this initiative once, but I was never really putting too much emphasis on it. So is it working? Do you think that it's going to achieve its objectives?
So at the moment, we have about 20 million hectares of degraded land that have been restored through this initiative. And this is a big achievement already. This represents an area the size of Cambodia. But this means, on the other hand, that they are still very short of achieving their ultimate goal because it's only 18% of the goal they have made for themselves so far. And Africa will need about $30 billion to fund this project. And there are issues with mobilizing the necessary capital. On the other hand, there has also been progress. In 2021, French President Emmanuel Macron and other world leaders announced an initiative called the Great Green Wall Accelerator to mobilize the necessary capital. And they pledged to mobilize $14 billion in new funding between 2021 and 2025. This has indeed helped to pick up the pace of mobilizing investments. As of March 2023, $2.5 billion have been pledged to be dispersed for this project. They will still need to mobilize much more, but I think it's a very interesting and promising initiative to improve food security and to fight against the causes of climate change. And I think this is why it's also very good to bring this at the end of our last section here to have somewhat a more promising and hopeful note at the end of this rather depressing topic.
Well, I really enjoyed this episode, and I really enjoyed the last point you made, Aramis, about the Great Green Wall and bringing a little bit of optimism into this discussion. I think that it just goes to show how we need to think about these proactive measures and how we shouldn't think about them when the conflicts have started, but rather ahead of it. So I'm glad that we talked about these conflicts in the horizon because it's important to shed light into it and think about how we can mitigate the risks of it.
Yeah, same here. Valeria and Armis, I enjoyed a lot having the chance to discuss this topic with you. It's really important. And yeah, it's not the brightest of them all. So at least we end in a little bit of a better note. And expanding on what you said, Valeria, yes, I agree. I think that sometimes we really do not put in enough of a spotlight on certain conflicts or developments throughout the world. The conflicts of Gaza and Ukraine have totally taken all the newspapers' titles these past years. So I think it would be interesting if we in the podcast try to put a little bit more of an effort on explaining what's happening, like other conflicts. And what we said today as Sudan, Ethiopia, I think would be incredible examples of how there's conflict all over. And as we explained today, climate change is just one factor that will accelerate and exacerbate the consequences of it.
Yes, so I would be looking forward, Fabio, to a little series about conflicts under the radar. Let's see what we can do here. For now, this is it for today. Thank you for tuning in and see you next time, warriors.